Hello and welcome to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast. If you'd like to become a patron of the podcast, we would love you to. And you can do so at patreon.com/the History Network. Thanks to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. The HistoryNetwork.org podcast, season 35, episode 6, 1 against 7. Eddie Rickenbacker proves himself. Again. This episode was written by Murray Darn. Murray is an ancient and medieval military historian from New Zealand living in Australia. He has written more than 100 articles on various aspects of ancient and medieval military history, as well as other historical topics from all periods, ranging from the history of opera to the runic alphabet and recipients of the Victoria Cross. He is the author of Macedonian Phalangite versus Persian Warrior, Athenian Hoplite versus Spartan Hoplite, and Leuctra 371 BC, all from Osprey Publishing. He is, of course, a regular writer on here and a regular on the Ancient Warfare podcast. By the time of America's entry into World War I in April 1917, Eddie Rickenbacker was already famous. Always obsessed with engines, he had become a mechanic to Lee Frayer in the 1906 Vanderbilt Cup at the age of only 15. In 1910, he became a race car driver himself, racing in the Indianapolis 500. In 1911, he joined the Duesenberg brothers to develop a new Mason racing car, with which Rickenbacker achieved national fame in 1914, becoming known as Fast Eddie for his hard driving and his daring, both skills he would later use as a pilot. He set a world land speed record at Daytona in 1914 of 134 miles per hour, 215 kilometers per hour. He moved around various racing teams and came close to being the championship driver in 1916. In 1916, he signed on to the British Sunbeam team and, despite the war, sailed for the UK. He was, however, detained in Liverpool, suspected of being the son of a disowned Prussian baron. A news story had invented these facts. He was, in fact, the third son of Swiss-German Ohio immigrants. Despite clearing his name, he soon abandoned the original spelling of his name, Rickenbacker, with a CH. In addition to his interests in land speed, Rickenbacker had already shown some interest in aviation. His first flight was in 1916. And his time in England reinforced that interest. He even suggested making a flying squadron out of racing car drivers, men who were experts in both motors and speed. He commented in the New York Times in February 1917 that war would practically put a stop to racing, and we have a training that our country would need in time of war. We are experts in judging speed and in motor knowledge. Rickenbacker volunteered as soon as America entered World War I, despite the fact he was earning an estimated $40,000 per annum as a racing driver. Sergeant Rickenbacker arrived in France as the chauffeur to Major Townsend F. Dodd, the first commissioned U.S. Army aviator. Fixing a broken rotor, Rickenbacker also impressed Lieutenant Colonel Billy Mitchell, the man regarded as the father of the United States Air Force. Rickenbacker may have pestered both of these aviators to give him a chance in the air. First, however, Rickenbacker was asked to become the chief engineer at the flight school at Issoudun Aerodrome, the largest air base in the world at the time, where US airmen were trained before leaving for the front. Rickenbacker took his chance and undertook flight training. He may have lied about his age, claiming to be 25, the upper limit for candidates. He was already 26. He received his 5 weeks training, 17 days or a total of 25 air hours in September 1917 and was commissioned as a lieutenant. Most pilots were genteel college students, and the rough, brusque Ohioan was not accepted by them despite, or perhaps because of, his expertise and fame. He was also over age, so the oldest among the pilots, and had no college degree, which was a requirement and another lie he may have told. But Rickenbacker persisted. His fellow trainees considered him uncouth and out of place. By March, Rickenbacker had finished gunnery training and moved to the Villeneuve-les-Vertus aerodrome. There he was mentored by Major Raoul Lufbery, a fighter ace who had served with the French Air Force before serving with the United States Army Air Service from 1917. The newly established 94th Aero Squadron, the Hat in the Ring Gang, was led by Lufbery, flying Nieuport 28 fighters, although many lacked armament. Rickenbacker's first combat patrol on March 6, 1918, was with Lufbery and another pilot. Only Lufbery's plane had guns. Rickenbacker would claim in his autobiography, written in 1967, "All I learned from Lufbery." Rickenbacker made his first sortie on April 13th, and on April 29th shot down his first enemy plane. The man who accompanied Rickenbacker and Lufbery on March 6th was Lieutenant Douglas Campbell. He had shot down his first enemy on April 14th and became America's first ace of the war. By May 28th, less than a month after his first victory, Rickenbacker had shot down his fifth enemy plane, and so had become an ace. He was awarded the Croix de Guerre for his efforts. Later he would be awarded the first of his 8 Distinguished Service Crosses for his victory on April 19th. By that time, however, Lufbery had been killed on May 19th, and Rickenbacker was sick with an abscess. During his convalescence, Rickenbacker reflected that he needed to be less foolhardy as a pilot and more disciplined. He had become lost in fog and was forced to land his plane in a field on one of his first flights, and had almost crashed more than once. Returning to active duty in September 1918, the squadron was now equipped with reliable SPAD 13s, and Rickenbacker's tally began to rise. A new commander was needed for the squadron, and 27-year-old Lieutenant Rickenbacker was chosen on September 24th. It would seem, however, that despite his successes, he was still not accepted. To prove to the men of his 94th Aero Squadron that he was one of them once and for all, and to demonstrate to them that he would never abandon his pilots or ask them to do something he wasn't willing to do himself, Lieutenant Eddie Rickenbacker took to the air alone on September 25, 1918, in the air over Billy. Spotting 7 enemy planes, 5 Fokker D-7s, protecting 2 Halberstadt CL-2s, Rickenbacker, disregarding the odds, attacked without hesitation. Diving on the enemy formation, diving through enemy planes, he downed one of the Fokkers and one of the Halberstadts, and then returned home. For his action he was awarded his 8th, a record, Distinguished Service Order. In 1931, President Herbert Hoover belatedly awarded him the Medal of Honor for his action. In total, Rickenbacker achieved a tally of 26 victories, making him the ace of aces for the United States during World War I. His tally would not be exceeded by an American pilot until Captain Richard Bong on April 12, 1944. Bong would be America's top ace of World War II with 40 victories. Rickenbacker still ranks as the USA's 10th top ace of all time. Rickenbacker's last 14 victories were achieved in October 1918, the penultimate month of the war, a month during which he was promoted to captain. Confirmation of victories was needed, and several did not come for some time, even after the war. Rickenbacker's first solo victory on May 7th, 1918, wasn't confirmed until another pilot, James Hall, who had been shot down and captured later in the same flight, was released. Rickenbacker did not like the title of Ace of Aces. It had been given out with glee to pilots during the war, and the three previous holders, Lufbery, David Putnam, and Frank Luke, had all been shot down and killed. Rickenbacker's luck, however, would continue to hold. Soon the 94th Squadron was taking out observation balloons to blind the eyes of the enemy. As proof of his superior leadership, several of Rickenbacker's men downed more of them than he did. Often the leaders of squadrons would use their men to bolster their own tally. Rickenbacker was not that kind of leader. Rickenbacker, however, flew more missions and had more hours in the air than any of his men, amassing 300 combat hours and 134 dogfights. He had several rules for his flyers to ensure their success and survival. He approached his enemies more carefully and closely than his colleagues did before opening fire. Early on in his fighting career, the guns on his Nieuport 28 kept jamming at this crucial moment, robbing him of several victories. He encouraged his men to only attack if they had at least a 50% chance of success, and to break for home if necessary. He held meetings with his pilots to discuss tactics and used blackboards to plot out how attacks could be managed. As a master mechanic himself, he also stressed the importance of engine maintenance and the reliability of the aircraft as being paramount to the pilot's success as flyers. Later, his rules included punctuality, loyalty, thrift, and a workaholic-like schedule. He would work 7 days a week. When the Armistice was declared in November 1918, Rickenbacker flew over no man's land alone and witnessed the lines of American and German troops meeting in celebration. He claimed, "I was the only audience for the greatest show ever presented. On both sides of no man's land the trenches erupted. Brown uniformed men poured out of the American trenches, grey-green uniforms out of the German. From my observer's seat overhead I watched them throw their helmets in the air, discard their guns, wave their hands." When he was discharged, he was promoted to major. Although he felt he had not earned that promotion and so continued to use captain, he became known as Captain Eddie for the rest of his career. He wrote a book, Fighting the Flying Circus, in 1919, but returned to the motor industry and founded the Rickenbacker Motor Company in 1922. He was soon in massive debt, however. He refused to declare bankruptcy and instead found some unorthodox avenues to pay off his debts. With backing, he bought and became the president of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway in 1927 and took up a position with Cadillac and LaSalle for General Motors. He began writing a comic strip in 1933, Ace Drummond, which was syndicated in 135 newspapers nationwide. The stories were inspired by his World War I experiences. He had refused the offer of a film career after the war, where he would have been employed in unspecified roles. The illustrator for the comic was Clayton Knight, a fellow World War I aviator. Although a New Yorker, he had flown for the British Royal Flying Corps. The series was turned into a film serial of 13 episodes in 1936, starring John King, Gene Rogers, and Noah Berry Jr. It even had Lon Chaney Jr. of the later Wolfman and Frankenstein fame in a small role. Amelia Earhart even visited the set. All the while, Rickenbacker promoted the potential of aviation and encouraged several cities to develop airports. His most long-lasting venture was the establishment of Eastern Air Lines in 1934, with help through his contacts at General Motors. He had already seen the potential of air mail and passenger transport in the 1920s, and with several associates he bought the company from General Motors in 1938, becoming president and general manager. In this capacity, Rickenbacker led many innovations in commercial aviation. He established connections with the Douglas Aircraft Company, although he later resisted the adoption of commercial jet aircraft. Why replace perfectly good turboprop airliners with expensive jets, he asked. He also survived several air crashes. He did not use the word safe of flying, but preferred reliable, such as in Atlanta in February 1941, when he was gravely wounded, taking more than a year to recover from his injuries. He supported the USA joining the Second World War before Pearl Harbor in December 1941, and when America joined the war, he toured training facilities in the USA and England as a non-military observer. He also directed Eastern Air Lines to fly American troops as well as munitions and other supplies across the Atlantic. This was not a requirement, but Rickenbacker encouraged the company to fulfill its duty to the best of its ability. He was involved in recommendations for military operations and advised on bombing strategy to both the Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Force. In October 1942, he was sent by U.S. Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson to the Pacific Theater. His B-17D flew off course and needed to ditch close to Japanese-controlled islands. Adrift for 24 days, Rickenbacker assumed command of the survivors, and they fished to survive. Eventually, all but one of the men was rescued. The ordeal led to reforms of navigation and survival equipment, which from then on included fishing tackle and rubber sheets to protect the men from sunburn and enable them to collect drinkable water via rain and condensation. Rickenbacker was then sent to the USSR in 1943 on a fact-finding mission, including what they were doing with Lend-Lease equipment already provided. He had clashed with President Roosevelt prior to the war over cancellations of airmail contracts during the New Deal in 1934, and so all his official missions came through Stimson rather than the president. At the conclusion of his USSR trip, he did a debrief with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, but never met with President Roosevelt. He resigned as president of Eastern Air Lines in 1959, finally retiring in 1963. He published his autobiography in 1967 and died in Switzerland in 1973 at the age of 82. His career is remembered for his achievements as America's ace of aces in World War I, but his legacy extends well beyond that into several critical developments in civil aviation and in practices developed in World War II and beyond. In everything he did, he brought persistence and determination to do the best he possibly could. Well, thank you once again, Murray, for writing that episode for us. If you would like to write an episode for us, or you want to contact us and give us an idea for a subject that you think we've not covered yet, then just drop us a line, info@thehistorynetwork.org for that. And once again, please do consider becoming a patron of the podcast at patreon.com/thehistorynetwork. Once again, thank you to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. Thanks again for listening. You've been listening to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast, written by Murray Dahm, read by Nick Barker.